Hello, I'm Jessica Samuels, and welcome to episode 7 of A Way Forward podcast presented by Beem Credit Union. Today's discussion is taking place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Okanagan Syilx people. This episode, CMHA Kelowna CEO Mike Gawliuk joins me, and we talk about loneliness and how, if it goes unaddressed, it can lead to some serious health issues. Thanks for being here, Mike. I think it's important for us right off the top to discuss what is loneliness, because it's actually not just, or it's more than just simply being alone.
Yes. So loneliness, one of the definitions is an emotional experience that means our current close relationships don't meet our needs. And so ultimately, it isn't just about being alone. It can mean, again, you're in a circle of people and you don't feel like you fit in. That can bring on a sense of loneliness. You've got a circle of connections where you're not necessarily getting the support and the connection that you want, and that can ultimately, result in feelings of loneliness. Through the loss, of a loved one or a friend, certainly that can bring on loneliness. And then absolutely, there are cases where a person is alone and wants to be with other people, where there's that emotional experience of loneliness. So I think to equate loneliness with being alone doesn't do the term the justice that it needs for people to truly appreciate and understand it.
That's right. And also and we'll delve into some of the significant impacts that it has in your life, and how to address them with kind of those different scenarios you were talking about. I did also just read a really interesting article. I think I sent it over to you. It was quite surprising to me. I think it was Harvard Business Review talking about loneliness in the workplace, which I was like, okay, this is interesting. And also thank you, Harvard Business Review, for your timely article. But it was interesting to me because I always associated being aware of significant loneliness for folks who were isolated, who had lost a loved one, or seniors as well, like folks who had something significant in their life happen or didn't have access to larger support groups. But it seems to me like we're hearing it more. Is loneliness on the rise, or is it one of those things that we're talking about it more so we're aware of it more?
Well, I think we're aware of it more, but certainly it's been referenced as an epidemic. So yeah, that's absolutely a concern. And the World Health Association in 2023 called it a pressing global threat. That's how major this is. And I think, as we'll get into it and we speak to it, is certainly, the impact that loneliness can have on us physically, and, the damaging effect that it can ultimately have. And, one article that I was looking at was doing research for this, compared loneliness to the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
What? Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Really. And the impact on the loneliness impact on someone's physical health. From increases in blood pressure to heart problems, to certainly mental health issues like depression and anxiety,
right,
and ultimately death. Like, it is serious and it's a concern. So
physiological symptoms in the moment, in the person at the time, and then also what I'm hearing is shortened lifespan.
Yes.
Oh gosh. Wow. Okay. Well, good thing we're talking about it. I mean, and sorry, like and obviously it's a serious topic, but when you put it in those terms, we always relate it to that smoke cigarettes a day kind of terms. I think it really talks about the seriousness of the condition. It's not just somebody's it's not just the feelings, right? Like obviously feeling lonely is how we describe it, but there's more going on in the body if you're going to have this very physical reaction.
Yeah.
So and we talked about seniors. Are there other groups that tend to experience loneliness? We're all experiencing, or we can all experience it, but are there kind of groups that are impacted more?
Well, in looking at some of the information in preparation for this, one group that was identified is Indigenous seniors. And part of that has to do with racism, potentially marginalization due to language, poverty, and of course, negative historical experience. And the reality that the oppression of Indigenous peoples and their cultures place people at higher risk for loneliness. We look at LGBTQ people who are at higher risk for loneliness when compared to their heterosexual peers. Certainly sexual minorities are more likely to be living alone, maybe not have children, have less contact with their family, and maybe at greater risk of social isolation.
Right. I go back to that. You're talking about the different types of loneliness, and you said, well, you might be around people or have the ability to be around people, but you don't quite fit in. You're not getting that sense of connection from the people who are around you. And that's what popped up to me when you identified those last two groups.
Yep.
Why does it feel like this is such a paradox? We are in a time where we are supposed to be so connected. You know, you were away for a week. I was just away in a different country in the South. And, you know, you're still texting in real time. You're answering emails in real time when you can. I'm FaceTiming with my husband to show him where I was staying and the beautiful sunset. We're supposed to be so connected, yet you said that this is being described as an epidemic.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, just prior to this, you said I just got 28 texts.
Yeah.
Right?
yeah, I did. I kind of was alarmed.
As an example, you know, the reality is, I think technology can give us the perception of connectedness, right? Versus being together, right? I think there's also the reality from a loneliness perspective of social media, and we had talked about this in a previous episode around the notion of comparison, right? And so you know, when you're looking at social media and you're seeing whoever it is living that perfect life, and you compare yourself to that. And ultimately, when you're making the comparison, you're always comparing what you see to be, you know, the worst parts of you to the best parts of them.
Right. So that can kind of force you to isolate yourself even more. Like, you don't live up. I can't compete. I'm not good enough. I don't connect with that particular group. And it kind of can become self-perpetuating.
Yeah. Well, and how many friends can you have ultimately?
Yeah.
I think one of the things I was reading about, like, put it in Facebook terms, for every 150 Facebook friends, that averages 4 actual real friends that might be there for you when you're in need, right?
Right.
So yeah, certainly we've got technology, we've got it right in front of us, and it gives the sense of connection, but you know, the reality is real connection is way more than that. And so technology can contribute actually to a sense of loneliness. Right.
Not that I want to blame everything on, you know, that little thing that happened in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. But what do we still understand the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic have had on us, and how that contributed to this sense of loneliness?
I think, I mean, there's ongoing research that's taking place as it pertains to the pandemic and loneliness. And certainly during the pandemic, people's experience of loneliness. I mean, again, when you're looking at, you know, a public health emergency, and the response to that is social isolation, the reality is you're gonna have some experience of loneliness. But in terms of the broader societal impact of the pandemic subsequent, that research is still taking place. We don't ultimately have all the answers at this point in time. So at a time, in a place back to that time, and I certainly remember those times, definitely that was a case, especially again in cases where people were maybe living on their own and your connection point was through the technology. The rest of it, we don't have a good sense, I would say, at this point in time as to the longer term impacts of the pandemic as it applies to loneliness and other factors.
Right, exactly. Okay, and that makes sense on kind of ongoing. And I think we recently talked about a report on the state of mental health in Canada, and it's getting worse as we get further out from the pandemic. So I kind of understand that point you're making about this is going to be kind of emerging and to be looked at. And the new areas of loneliness. So this Harvard Business Review article, I was scrolling on LinkedIn and because, to feel connected to the world. No, just kidding. And I read at quick glance the title, and it says, "We're still lonely at work." And it caught me, and I was like, this is really interesting. And I had all kinds of thoughts that were going through my head. So what's really interesting to me in this is that I do have a full-time job. I am a business owner. We actually sell office furniture. So we're very embedded in the understanding of the return to office, RTO, and the WFH, work from home, because obviously that could financially impact what I do in my day job as a business owner. So when I read this title, that's what I went to. I thought, okay, this is going to be another article about work from home and return to work and hybrid models and plus. But it really wasn't that at all. And in fact, it actually points out that being in the office was not the cure by itself to loneliness at work. And that was kind of like, wait, what? And it kind of goes back to what you were saying before about being around people. So being at work, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem at loneliness at work. So why are we lonely at work?
Well, first of all, thanks for sharing the article.
Yeah, yeah.
Because as a mental health organization, certainly one of the things that we focus significant energy on is the mental health of our workforce, and there's some reminders in there, right? I think again it breaks it down to some of the myths, and one of the myths is that like loneliness is a personal problem, not an organizational problem. And to your point that by returning to the office and doing in-person work, that's going to be the thing that's going to make all the difference in the world, when in fact that's not the case. Certainly what the article talks about, first of all, is making it a priority. They actually suggest measuring loneliness in the workplace to get a sense of what that looks like and what's happening there. And this term is going to come up again and again and again as we have our conversations, but they talk about building a culture of connection, right? And so, building socialization into the rhythm of work, and being able to spend time together, and have social activities, and maximize work opportunities to enhance that sense of connection, as some of the strategies that need to be considered to help address loneliness in the workplace.
And I can imagine that we would have to go back to the reasons why the individual is feeling lonely in the workplace. I mean, and to kind of pile on to something that you see, like a pizza party is not going to solve a problem for an individual who's feeling lonely at work because they don't fit in with their peers. And I'm overly simplifying, but I would just like folks to have that takeaway, to say that it's not a staff party alone is not going to solve this.
Yeah, I would suggest ultimately, and again, from what I've read and in my experience, is like you've got to come to a true understanding of what's taking place. Like there's all the things you can do to, tick the boxes. So yeah, a pizza party is what it is.
Yeah.
I think the opportunity for people to get together and connect would be what's underneath that, and that's ultimately the case, right?
Right.
But it goes beyond tick boxes and the things that we think that we should do to having really a good understanding of our organizations, having a good understanding of the people within our organizations, and then what are the things that ultimately organizations can do to support building that culture of connection, providing those opportunities for those things to happen.
You mentioned that one of the ways to address this in the workplace was measuring it. Are you talking about like a survey or a questionnaire? Like I know that the CMHA Kelowna does the Guarding Minds, I believe, or has in the past. Are you talking about something like that measures the psychological well-being of staff in the workplace?
Yeah, I definitely. That's ultimately what I'm talking about, and the use of an anonymized survey to get a sense of what that looks like, then allows organizations ultimately, and what we would look to do to then see what we're doing well, seeing what ultimately people need, and then moving forward with trying to implement some of those things, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So solutions for loneliness in the workplace. Let's keep going forward with solutions here, and let's have a little discussion about individuals who are experiencing loneliness due to loss of a loved one or a significant figure in their lives. Grief is a complex issue. And so what are some suggested ways that perhaps folks can manage their loneliness due to that?
Yeah, certainly grief and loss, as we touched on. I think that's a very, very human experience, right? One of the things that they say, first thing is that don't should all over yourself. The reality is grief is going to look different for every person, and so not to put expectations on your grief and think about how you should and should not feel. Everybody's grief is unique ultimately, and how each person approaches grief will differ. Certainly some of the other pieces is letting others that offer to help and support, allowing people into your world and allowing that to happen. Finding and giving yourself things to do, whatever that might look like. And that goes hand in hand with avoiding isolation. So the last thing you're going to want to do is attend a social event or anything like that. That tends to build on itself, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So some of the suggestions are like, when there's an opportunity for a social connection, if it's a social event, that piece, go, but maybe you drive yourself to the event and you're there for a bit and then leave. But certainly socializing, trying to build connections, engaging, are some of the ways that people can deal with grief. And I mean, ultimately, depending on the level of grief and how people are managing, certainly I would recommend and encourage, counseling as well to help support people through that. Right.
Because if your feeling lonely due to grief, part of it would be managing the grief component of it, and hopefully the loneliness would come alongside that as well. It's hard to offer suggestions to folks for in different perspectives of why they perhaps might be feeling lonely. I mean, I don't know. I've never had I shouldn't say that. I was going to say I've never had an experience that I didn't feel like I fit in, that I wasn't able to kind of readily manage within a short amount of time. But, when we talk about people who are feeling lonely because they don't fit in or they don't have that support and connections, ultimately, yes, it sounds like building the connections and the support is the way to go. But I would imagine that part of the reason why that is absent in their life is that they do not know how to go about doing it.
Sure. I mean, ultimately, that's highly likely that they don't know how to go about doing it. One of the things that was talked about in terms of addressing that is understanding the reasons why you feel lonely. When they talk about social connection, one of the terms that was used was to be strategic. So everybody's got their own interests, right? So whether or not you know you're into sports or another activity, like using that interest to then potentially build connections. So maybe you join a sports league, something like that. Things that align with ultimately what you enjoy and what you like. It can be little steps, right? So again, in where there's a close connection that you have, even if you have decent connections with your family, trying to reach out on a more regular basis. And that might mean picking up the phone and having a phone call versus, again, sending a text message or getting lost in the world of the make-believe connection sometimes that technology can be. And sometimes, and certainly what's encouraged as well is to get involved in your community, the potential of volunteering, right? So for example, and it sounds simple, but you know, if you're an animal lover, there's maybe opportunities to go and volunteer at a place like the SPCA, something along those lines. Getting to know your neighbors can be one way to just sort of to start to crack that door open a little bit.
Like so much of what we talk about here on Mike, this is a complex issue, and there's no easy thing that is going to solve it, but it's something that we have to pay attention to, or else we will have some very serious health ramifications and mental health ramifications. So ultimately, when it comes to loneliness, what is your suggestion? How do we as individuals address it, and how can we support others in our life who we may think might be experiencing this?
I mean, I think the big message is that human beings are hardwired for connection. They're hardwired for social activity. And you know, in thinking about that, it comes back to this thing about the notion of community and connection. And how important that is in terms of addressing loneliness, how important that is overall in addressing mental health. And earlier this week, I was at a session at a conference I attended, and there was a gentleman there by the name of Guy Felicella, and he's fairly well known in the province and in Canada as someone who has struggled with substance use. Spent 20 years on the downtown east side, is open to telling a story around the number of overdoses, involvement with the criminal justice system, what it was like to be unhoused, and for him, what made the difference. And the term that he used is that ultimately, when it comes to people, human connection can change direction. And ultimately, that's part of the way forward.
Wow. Powerful statement. I think we will leave it there. We do have a number of resources I know that you pulled from and I pulled from in order to have this discussion. We're going to list them on the website, on the A Way Forward podcast page presented by Beem Credit Union, because what's going to be right for people, the human connection, but in what shape or form that comes in, it's going to be different for each individual. So we'll make sure that we get those on the page, and hopefully some folks can really find a way forward in that regard. Mike, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Beem Credit Union is proud to be a part of communities all across BC, with over 50 branches and insurance offices dedicated to supporting your financial journey. Beem understands financial wellness means something different to everyone, and they're here to help you achieve your unique goals. Whether you're saving for the future, planning your next big step, or just looking for peace of mind, Beem Credit Union is by your side. GFCU Savings, Gulf and Fraser, Interior Savings, and North Peace Savings are trade names of Beem Credit Union.